Hello, this is Goddess7, and today I am going to teach you how to make custom music for Mario 64DS. Now, this method also applies to other games, some of which being New Super Mario Bros. DS, but I figured I'd show you Mario 64DS since that's kind of what I do. And ultimately, the groups will fall better for how I do it, and it's what I'm more used to, and that's probably what you're here for to begin with. Now, I know that a tutorial on this already exists, but it's rather outdated, and so I need a fresh one to teach you the true method of Mario 64DSe music creation. Now, what you're going to need here is Super Mario 64DSe, NCS Bank BGM Massive.rar, Nitro Studio 2, you need an MIDI of choice, and your ROM, of course. Now, in the future, you won't need this, but if you go to the download for Nitro Studio 2, there are some known bugs where the audio conversion is faulty, and because of that, I made a temporary converter for the time being. You may not need it specifically here, but you're going to need it if you want to replace custom SFX or instruments. And now I'm going to extract Nitro Studio 2. I'm going to extract the massive bank. And the first thing I'm going to do is open my ROM in Mario 64DSe. And I'm going to go to the file system and extract the sound data to SDAT. The SDAT file is what contains all the audio data in the Mario 64DS ROM, so it is rather important for this tutorial. And then I'm going to open it up in Nitro Studio 2. Now, I highly recommend you get the Nintendo converter for the best conversion experience. I won't tell you where to get that though. And as you see here, I now have the Nintendo converters from the Nitro SDK. If you don't have them, it's not a big deal. You can still import music without them, although I kind of recommend using them as they tend to be more accurate most of the time than the MIDI to SSEQ, and the Nitro Studio importer will be the definitive one to use once it's done, but unfortunately it's not at the moment. Once you see it is done on the feature list, so feel free to just use it as much as you want. Alright, once I open my SDAT here, what I want to do is add a new instrument bank. And I want to replace this with the massive SBNK. But now you're wondering, well, what wave archive do I hook it up to? Because now it's just hooked up to a bunch of blanks and will produce no sound. Well, first I'm going to rename that NCS Bank BGM Massive. And well, if I go into the massive bank, you can see that there's a SWR here, and that's actually what we're going to use. We're going to go to the wave archives and we're going to add one. Replace this with our SWR. And that'll be it. NCS Wave BGM Massive. Now, why I'm telling you to use this massive bank or SWR is because it actually contains just about every instrument in Super Mario 64DS. I made it so that way you don't have to go hunt around for each banks or so, but of course you're completely welcome to use other banks for your music. It's just that I recommend using the massive bank as if you want the full instrument catalog for Mario 64DS. Now, how to make banks like that, like the massive one I made, I'll tell you later. But for now, let's go ahead and make our SSEQ for the game. Now, I should briefly go over how the SDAT works in a sense. So what you have first is wave archives. These contain all the instruments, sounds, SFX, anything you could think of. And next you have banks, which contain instruments for the song to play. Like over here we have this instrument, this one, and so on. Oh, I almost forgot to hook it up to the massive WAV archive. Don't forget to hook up your WAV archives for the banks. That's an important step. And now we have sequences which take a bank as its instrument list and they play raw notes. Think of sequences as MIDIs, but for the DS. In sequence archives, you can kind of think of folders of sequences or MIDIs, like this seqarc player or voice. They all just have a bunch of sequences inside one file. Alright, so now that I've explained how the SDAT primarily works, I'll get into groups in a second, sequence players. We're going to make our sequence. So I'm going to use FL Studio. Even though I'm using FL Studio, you can use your music editor of choice. I just so happen to use FL Studio. Now I'm going to open my MIDI. The Shininger, and I'm going to just hit accept. Make sure add Fruity LSD to the project is selected. And then I'm going to click this and get rid of all of this junk to reveal Fruity LSD. Now I'm going to use this to open up my DLS file. If you want a DLS file, you can actually right click any of these banks and export it as an SF2 or DLS depending on what your sequencer needs. My sequencer needs a DLS, so I'm going to use a DLS. Now if I play the song, it's going to sound a bit weird. So what you actually have to do is change the instruments. You can get a list of the instruments by opening up the massive bank. And you have a list here. You can press space to preview them. Now, there may be a case where you don't hear any sound, and if you don't hear any sound, you need to save your SDAT and then reopen it. And if you do that, then you'll start hearing sound. That's a little bug with Nitro Studio 2 at the moment. And so, generally what you want to do is, say I like how this instrument sounds, I'm going to change this instrument to, this says 33, so I'd go 33 plus 1, which would be 34. Instruments on Nitro Studio 2 start at 0, while instruments here start at 1, so that's why you need to do that addition. But hang on a second, you saw it that I changed, but it went back. And that has to do with Midi controllers. Now this is an FL specific thing only, it's a bit annoying, but you have to go before you change anything to target control, and then you have to see one that says general Midi patch. Click on it, hit the red X, and drag it like that. And then you can just use the scroll bar to go through all the tracks and delete the general Midi patches. And you can see I deleted all the, oh, almost missed one. Alright, I removed all the general Midi patches. Now if I go to target control, I meant the patch here, and I set it as 34, you can see that actually changed the music here. I recommend using the solo tracks and slowly start putting them on as you keep changing the instrument. And remember, you have the list here to select from, or whatever bank you're using for your song. It doesn't even have to be from Mario 64DS. You can export and import SF2s or SBNKs and WAV archives from any game. It's just that if I want to say use this bank in Mario Bros. DS, I'm going to have to export both the NCS BGM resident wave archive and the Silver Star wave archive here. And then when I import the bank to Mario Bros. DS, I'm going to have to make sure to set for this bank resident as wave archive 0 and wave archive 1, because this is how banks know how to get their sounds. Now I'm just going to go ahead and set all the instruments to what you want. I recommend you do the same. Now if you try and change these volumes, you may also realize it doesn't work. So in the piano roll, target control, you can change delete the controls for the channel volume. The only reason I would be wary of that is if you have a MIDI that does change the volume and such within the middle of the song. So I'm going to go cut to when I have all the instruments how I want them. Alright, now I have everything how I want it, and I've had the MIDI to my liking. And you can see it plays pretty nicely. And then once you do that, you're going to go to File, Export MIDI file. And then I'm just going to call this slow song.midi. And go ahead and hit start. Alright, now once you do that, you're going to want to open it up in Anvil Studio 2. I'll link in the description where you can get that. Alright, now I'm going to open the song. And now this is what you use to set your loop points. You saw me delete that channel at the beginning. That actually controls a lot of things like the tempo. So remember the current tempo you have, in this case it's 83, hit save, hit file, open, and then set that back to the tempo it was before and hit 83, then hit file, save song. Now for the loop start, it doesn't matter where I put it for my purposes, I'll just put it here. I'll just put it here for whatever reason. This aligns with each measure, which is pretty useful. And now if you want to use the generic MIDI to SSEQ importer, you're going to do loop start. But I'm going to use the Nintendo importer, so you're going to do a left open bracket if that's the case. And then for the loop end, you would do loop end if you are using the SSEQ to MIDI. Remember, capitalization is very important with how you type it. But for my case, I'm just going to do a right bracket. Then once I do that, I have my cues set. If I click them, it goes to the right location. I'm going to hit File, Save Song. And then I'm going to go to the sound data. Now, a cool thing is you don't actually have to replace a sequence that already exists. If you want, you can just go to Add, and you can just add a new one. Just like that. Just make sure to set the bank to massive, or whatever bank you used. And before you go ahead and hit Replace, oh, sorry, accidentally double-clicked it, you're going to go to Settings, and if you're using MIDI to SSEQ, then you want to click this, or if you're using Nintendo tools like me, you want to click that. So go ahead, use the importer you want. Again, it doesn't matter what you do, I just happen to be using the Nintendo importer, and then I'm just going to rename it to whatever I want. Slow song. There we go. Now I'm going to replace it with my song. And you can see it's 3.2 kilobytes. Now, this number is actually significant. And I'll show you why in a second with the player. So if you go into the player, you see this heap size here. Now, if you go to a calculator in programming mode, and you type in 2C00, this gives you 11,264. Now the reason that's significant is because this is 3.2, and that's less than 11,264. But let's just say for a second this thing was 15 kilobytes. 15 kilobytes would be 15,000 or so bytes, and that is greater than 11,264. If that's the case, then that song actually would not load in game. So in order to combat that, say I had 15,000, I would have to, and that was the size of my SSEQ in bytes, I would have to make this to 3A98 in order to actually get the sequence to load. So basically the heap size has to always be higher than the sequence of your song. That's why I used a Nintendo importer, because it's usually pretty good at compressing the song to as small as it can be. Alright, then once you do that, you can save, you can loop and preview how it sounds. Now, we're not ready to try this in-game yet. There's actually quite a bit of stuff we need to do. Because, let's face it, if we look at the wave archive we use, it's absolutely massive. Like, absolutely massive. This thing is 688.8 kilobytes. The DS RAM, or sound RAM, cannot fit that big of a wave archive in it with all the sound effects and everything else loaded. So what we actually need to do is only use the instruments we need. So I'm going to go into Tools, Bank Generator. Now what this thing is useful for is taking existing banks in the game and creating completely new ones. So what I'm going to do is figure out how many instruments I need at first. And that's going to be the unique number of instruments. So I'm just going to take a notepad and write down the instruments I need. I'm also going to keep this so it's always on top too for convenience. 10. So I have quite a bit of instruments here. 59. Oh. Do I have 59? No, I do not. And now that I have my instruments list, what I'm going to do for each one is subtract 1 from it. So 9, 32, 55. Alright, so now once you have your list of instruments, you want to open up the bank generator. And now for the bank, I'm just going to put all of them as the massive bank. Now this is essentially how I created the massive bank in the first place, by just taking different instruments from all of the different banks in Mario 64DS. So I'm just going to count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm just going to type in the numbers, 9, 32, 55, 57, 15, 14, 1, and 58. Alright, so then once you have all those, I'm just going to keep those. You want to keep these to use the generated wave archive, as I want to use the same one, and also remember to change the instrument here too. Alright, so then once you have them all lined up and matching, as they all match here, I can just quit out of that and hit Create Bank and Wave Archive. Now this may take a second, but then once you do, I'm just going to rename this NCSWave BGM Slow Song. NCS Bank BGM Slow Song. And you can see Nitro Studio 2 was smart and already had it use the wave archive. And if I go over here, it's 70.4 kilobytes. Now that's pretty good. Alright, let's say for a minute that I wanted to make the slow bank or slow song even lower in file size. What I can actually do is open the wave archive here, and then I can open the resident wave archive since this is usually loaded, and see for a wave that matches. Alright, I know this one definitely exists in the resident. And they just so happen to have the same wave ID. So I'm going to go to Audacity. And I'm going to, I guess that's a mistake. Tracks, add new, mono track. And then I'm just going to have nothing on it. And I'm going to export this as a wave. And I'm going to go to desktop, tutorial, and call this blank.wave. Then I'm just going to drag this onto the wave converter, and it actually does not like that. So what I think the reason why it does not like that is because there's actually nothing in it. So also be sure to set the project length to 8,000 as that's usually. And I'm just going to have seconds. I'm just going to make it so there's barely anything here. See, look how small that is. And I'm going to export that as a wave, blank, export that. Then I'm going to drag it onto the converter. And you can see here I have a small wave, but I think I can make it a bit smaller. I'm going to remove some more from it, so that's only that much. Export as a wave. Then I'm going to convert it again. And you can see here that it's relatively small. It's not as small as it can be, but it's pretty small. You can try and make it smaller if you want. And what I'm going to do is replace the one in my generated bank with the blank.swave, and it should play nothing. And then I'm going to save this. And of course you want to repeat this process for whatever you do. And then I'm going to go to my slow song bank, have it use the resident bank. And then I'm going to go for the instruments. And for every instrument that uses wave archive 0, wave ID 4, which was the one I just replaced, I'm going to want to change that to use the new resident one. So this one uses the fourth one that I just replaced. So I now want it to use that one in the resident that already exists. And it just so happened that that one was 4, as you saw earlier. If it were, say, 5, I would change it to that, but that's not the case. Then I'm just going to keep going through, and no. And that should be it. And then last thing I'm going to do is change my slow song bank to use the new bank I generated. And then I'm going to save that. And then you have to reopen the SDAT after you do that. And once you do that, the song should play perfectly fine. If it doesn't, then either it's a glitch with the player but most likely you did not set up your sequences or banks right, or you did not reopen the SDAT file. So then after you do that, we're going to see what level we want to put this in. So we're going to go to Levels, Bob-omb Battlefield. Alright, so Bob-omb Battlefield is one of the strange ones, and I'll get more into that in a minute, but you want to go to the level settings where you have all the sequence settings, and slow song is SSQ number 83. So I'm going to go ahead and go to 83. And now SSBNKID is actually the sound effect bank. And what this really means is what kind of enemies do you have. If you have enemies that are present in Bob-omb Battlefield, like Chain Chomps, Goombas, or whatever, you might want this sound effect bank, which is 33. If you have enemies in, say, Lethal Lava Land, you're probably going to want the fire kind of thing. It doesn't necessarily mean the Sage slot, just the kind of enemies you have, but I'm going to leave it at 33, because that's what I'm going to use. And the group ID is what we're going to do next. So groups are kind of special. And here's the thing, the groups in Bob-omb Battlefield are hard-coded to be these three groups right here. This one appears whenever the Bob-omb King has a mission. I think this might be either mission 1 and the one where you fight him again, or maybe it's just the mission 1, I'm not sure. This one appears when you play with or race with Koopa the Quick, and this one is for every other mission. Now what we actually want to do is modify our groups to how we would want our songs. But I'm just going to kind of show you how you would create a group for anything that's not Bob-omb Battlefield or doesn't have a hard-coded group. In which case you'd just start with a fresh group, and then you'd first add in SC object, then you want to add in SC act obj. Here it is, these are some object stuff. Then you would add the bank, or the wave archive for the bank you want, in this case I'm using the Bob-omb Battlefield bank because there's Bob-omb Battlefield enemies. And then you would want the wave archive, or I'm sorry, the actual bank for that one, which in this case is Bob-omb Battlefield. So I have the wave archive. Oh, that's a wave archive. I want to load the bank. Bank SCT Bame. Yep, just like that. And you want to make sure that says bank. So you shouldn't have to touch the load flags, but they should look something like that. And then that's just the basics for how you get SFX working. Then you start adding wave archives for what you want. And the first one you want to add is for the wave archives that your song needs. Mine needs the wave archive for the slow song, and it also needs the wave archive for the resident. And typically you want the resident always loaded, because you're going to need to load the wave archive for when you clear level, which is clear Shijou. And then you can also add other wave archives for what you need. If you have the owl, you're going to want the owl fly. If you have the metal cap used, you want this one. If you want the wing cap or invisible flower, you're going to want this one used. If you use silver stars, you're going to need this. If you have the goal sound effect or like a boss, you're going to want to load the boss, or so. It all depends on what you have on the level. But again, the Bob-omb Battlefield stuff is hard-coded for the most part. Well, except for this one. This one you can actually change to anything, but I recommend just leaving it for simplicity. What I just showed you there is more so for other levels. that are not Bob on Battlefield. But for this one, instead of Chijo Ooh, I'm just going to use my slow song. And then I'm going to do that here. Alright, so now I've replaced all the Chijus with slow song. And that's enough. If you have silence in game, it's because either you didn't replace the SDAT or because you are loading too much. In this case, I might be loading too much. We'll see in a second whether or not. So I'm going to save the SDAT. I'm going to change the group ID if I did. Say if this were my new level, like if I were replacing Worm's Fortress, I would set this to 56 because that's the new group I made. But in this case, I'm going to leave it at 6. I'm going to hit OK, hit save, exit out of that. Then I'm going to go to the file system and I'm going to replace the sound data with the sound data I just edited. And then I'm going to see how it sounds in game. And you can hear that my custom music is playing correctly. And all the sound effects seems to still be working, which is good. Now I hope you guys enjoy this tutorial and that you learned something new about importing DS music, and I shall see you all later.